October 15th, 2023. Three men cornered Sylvester Stallone in the alley behind Gino's Steaks at 2:47 a.m. They had guns. They had orders. They thought they had an easy target. Frank Balboa had been walking home from his late shift at the construction site. Same route for 15 years. Same quiet shuffle past the dumpsters and graffitied walls where he'd once trained as a kid. The men stepped out of the shadows like they owned the darkness. "You know why we're here, old man." Frank's hands didn't shake. His voice stayed steady. "Yeah, I've been waiting." What happened in the next 3 minutes became legend in South Philly. The kind of story fathers tell sons. The kind that reminds you some men don't break, no matter how many years pass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first gunman made the mistake of stepping too close. Frank's right hand, calloused from decades of swinging hammers and throwing punches, caught him square in the throat. The man dropped like a sack of cement, his weapon clattering across the wet asphalt. The second man raised his pistol, but Frank was already moving. 15 years of construction work hadn't stolen his speed. It had made him economical. Every motion counted when you were framing houses for 12 hours straight. Same principle applied here. He grabbed the gunman's wrist, twisted until something snapped, and drove his elbow into the man's solar plexus. The third enforcer was smarter. He backed up, kept his distance, kept his gun trained on Frank's chest. "Easy, champ. We just want to talk." Frank straightened, breathing steady. His back ached from the day's work, but his hands were solid. Always had been. "Then talk. The gloves, the note. You got them, right? Yeah. Then you know what this is about." Frank nodded slowly. Mickey's old Everlast training gloves had arrived 3 days ago, wrapped in brown paper. No return address, just an envelope with his name scrawled in handwriting he didn't recognize, and inside, an address in the Italian market he'd spent 15 years avoiding. "Mickey Goldmill," the gunman said, like he was testing the name. "Your trainer. Died October 12, 2008. Funny thing about that night. Nothing funny about a man dying. $3 million went missing that same night. Outfit money, never found." Frank's jaw tightened. The alley felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in like the ropes of a ring he couldn't escape. "I don't know nothing about any money." See, that's where things get interesting. The man's smile was all teeth and shadows. "Because somebody thinks you do. Somebody who's been very patient, very careful. Someone who knew Mickey real well." A siren wailed in the distance, still blocks away but getting closer. The gunman heard it too. His eyes flicked toward the mouth of the alley, calculating. "This ain't over, Balboa. You got 48 hours to remember what you forgot. Check your mailbox tomorrow, and next time we won't be so polite." He backed toward the street, stepping over his groaning partners. "Oh, and Frank? Next time we won't come for you first." The threat hung in the air like smoke as the three men disappeared into the October night. Frank stood alone among the dumpsters and broken glass, his hands slowly unclenching. The smell of cheesesteaks and motor oil filled his nostrils, mixing with something else, the metallic taste of fear he hadn't felt in years. His phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number: "Tomorrow, 1247 S 9th Street. Come alone." The address from the envelope. Mickey's old neighborhood. Frank deleted the message and started walking home, his footsteps echoing off the narrow walls. South Philadelphia stretched around him like a living thing, all row houses and corner stores, fire escapes and American flags. This was his world, had been for 78 years. Every cracked sidewalk, every painted door, every face in every window told a story he knew by heart. But tonight, walking past Marconi Plaza where he'd proposed to Adrian 43 years ago, past the gym where he'd learned to fight, past the church where they'd buried his wife, Frank felt like a stranger in his own life. The truth was, he'd been expecting this for 15 years. The night Mickey died, Frank had been there. Not in the room, but close enough to hear the argument, close enough to see who walked out of that building at 11:43 p.m., carrying a duffel bag that hadn't been there before. Close enough to make a choice. He'd chosen silence, chosen to protect what mattered most. Adrian's final months before the cancer took her, his son Rocky Jr.'s shot at a normal life, the neighborhood's faith in something pure and good in a world that had precious little of either. But silence had a price. It always did. Frank turned onto his street, a narrow corridor of brick and hope, where Italian grandmothers still hung wash on Mondays and kids played stickball against fire hydrants. His house sat in the middle of the block, 2 stories of working-class dignity with a front stoop Adrian had swept every morning for 37 years. The mailbox flag was up. Frank hadn't put any mail out. Hadn't touched the box since this morning. He approached slowly, every instinct screaming. The metal box creaked open under his fingers, revealing a single manila envelope. No postmark, no stamp, just his name in that same unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, a photograph. Black and white, grainy with age. Mickey's Gym, 2008. 2 figures in conversation near the heavy bags. One was Mickey, gesturing wildly like he always did when money was involved. The other figure had his back to the camera, but Frank knew that silhouette, knew it better than his own reflection. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "You saw everything, didn't you, Uncle Frank?" Uncle Frank. Only one person had ever called him that. Mickey's nephew, Tommy Gunn. The photograph trembled in Frank's weathered hands as 30 years collapsed into this single moment. Tommy, barely 16 when he'd first walked into Mickey's Gym with nothing but hunger and fists that moved like lightning. Tommy, who'd called Frank uncle because Mickey was the closest thing to family either of them had. And in Mickey's world, respect flowed downhill like water. Tommy, who'd disappeared 3 days after Mickey's funeral. Frank climbed the front steps slowly, each creak of the old wood familiar as his own heartbeat. The house key stuck in the lock, always did when the October cold settled in, and he had to jiggle it twice before the door gave way. Inside, the smell of yesterday's coffee and the ghost of Adrian's perfume still lingered in the hallway, mixing with the scent of sawdust from his work clothes. The living room hadn't changed much since Adrian passed. Same burgundy sofa where she'd folded laundry every Sunday. Same framed photos covering the mantelpiece like a shrine to better days. Their wedding, Rocky Jr.'s high school graduation, that night at the Academy Awards, when Hollywood briefly remembered Philadelphia had heroes too. The championship belts gathering dust in their display case, leather and gold catching the streetlight that filtered through lace curtains. Frank sank into his recliner, the photograph still burning in his palm. The chair molded around him like an old glove, worn smooth by 15 years of sitting here each night, replaying the choice he'd made, the choice to walk away, to let sleeping dogs lie, to choose love over truth. The grandfather clock in the corner, Adrian's grandmother's, brought over from Italy in 1952, chimed midnight. 12 deep, resonant notes that seemed to echo longer than they should in the quiet house. Frank closed his eyes and let himself remember. Tommy Gunn had been everything Frank wasn't at that age, smooth, charming, quick with words and quicker with his hands. Where Frank had fought with heart, Tommy fought with precision. Where Frank had been loyal to a fault, Tommy had been ambitious to a fault. Mickey had loved them both, but differently. Frank was the son he never had. Tommy was the fighter he'd dreamed of training. "You got the tools, kid," Mickey used to tell Tommy, adjusting his stance, correcting his footwork. "But tools ain't everything. Heart is everything. You remember that." But Tommy hadn't remembered. He'd left Philadelphia for Las Vegas, chasing big money and bigger dreams. Left Mickey behind like an old coat that didn't fit anymore. Broke the old man's heart in ways that had nothing to do with his ticker and everything to do with love. Frank's phone buzzed against his chest. Text message. Unknown number again. "Saw the news about your construction company, Uncle Frank. Balboa Brothers building. Nice touch, bringing in Rocky Jr. family business now. That's beautiful, real beautiful. Would hate to see anything happen to it." Frank's blood turned cold. Rocky Jr., his boy, now 38 and married with kids of his own, had joined the company 2 years ago, finally ready to embrace the Balboa name instead of running from it. They'd been bidding on a big contract, renovating row houses in Point Breeze. Honest work, clean money. Everything Frank had built his second life around. Another message, 1247 S 9th Street. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. Bring what's mine, what's mine. as if Frank had taken something, as if 15 years of silence had been about greed instead of grief. The truth was simpler and more complicated than Tommy could ever understand. The night Mickey died, Frank had been there because Mickey had called him, scared, talking fast about money he shouldn't have taken, debts he couldn't pay, choices that had consequences. The old man had gotten in deep with people who measured loyalty in dollars and settled debts in blood. Frank had been 2 blocks away when the shot rang out, close enough to see Tommy running from the building, that duffel bag heavy in his hands. Close enough to make the choice that had defined the last 15 years of his life. He could have followed. Could have confronted Tommy right there on the street. Could have called the cops, told them what he'd seen, let justice run its course. Instead, he'd thought about Adrian in her hospital bed, fighting cancer with the same fierce determination she'd brought to everything else. Thought about Rocky Jr., just starting college, finally free from the weight of being a champion's son. Thought about the neighborhood kids who still asked for autographs, who still believed in heroes. So he'd walked away. Let Tommy disappear with whatever he'd taken. Let the questions die with Mickey. Built a wall of silence around the truth and spent 15 years laying bricks on the other side. But silence was a living thing. It grew, it festered, and eventually it came home. Frank stood, his knees protesting after the day's work. Outside, South Philadelphia slept, but he could feel it watching, waiting. The same streets that had made him champion were about to demand an accounting. 48 hours, the gunman had said. Time to pay the bill. Frank hadn't slept, couldn't. Every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps. Every car that passed on the street might be them, watching, waiting. By 5 a.m. he was already dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with black coffee gone cold, staring at his reflection in the window glass. The mailbox flag was up again. This time he didn't hesitate. 3 quick steps down the front walk, metal box creaking open like a coffin lid. Another envelope, heavier this time. His name in that same careful handwriting that belonged to a ghost. Inside, Mickey's reading glasses. The thick black frames held together with electrical tape. One lens cracked from the night Mickey had taken a fall in the gym's office. Frank remembered that night. 1997, maybe 98. Mickey, 73 years old and still trying to move heavy bags by himself, too proud to ask for help. These things are older than dirt, Adrian had said, watching Mickey squint through the damaged lens. Why don't you get new ones? 'Cause these ones still work, Mickey had replied, the way he always did about anything he'd grown attached to. Ain't broke enough to throw away. But there was something else in the envelope. A cassette tape, the kind Mickey used to record his fighters' training sessions. The plastic case was yellowed with age, and someone had written across the label in faded ink for Uncle Frank. The night everything changed, Frank's hands shook as he turned the tape over. On the back, in Tommy's younger handwriting, October 12, 2008. Mickey's final lesson. The old boombox was still in the basement, buried under paint cans and Christmas decorations Adrian had insisted on keeping. Frank found it covered in dust, its silver antenna bent from years of moving it around the house. The power cord was frayed, but it still plugged in, still hummed to life like it had 1,000 times before. He slid the tape in and pressed play. Static. Then Mickey's voice, distant but unmistakable. You listening, kid? Good, 'cause this might be the last time I get to teach you something. The sound quality was terrible, recorded on one of those cheap handheld devices. But Frank could hear everything. Mickey's labored breathing, the squeak of the office chair, and underneath it all, another voice, younger, familiar. I told you, Mickey, I don't have the money. Market's been brutal. Don't give me that Wall Street bullshit, Tommy. You took $3 million in outfit money and promised them 12% return. Where is it? Gone. Lost. The whole fund collapsed when Lehman went under. Frank's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the basement floor. Tommy's voice, 15 years younger but already carrying the weight of desperation. This wasn't a recording of Mickey's murder. This was a recording of Mickey trying to save his nephew's life. You stupid kid, Mickey continued on the tape. You think these people care about market conditions? You think they're gonna write this off as a business loss? I can get it back. Give me 6 months, maybe a year. You don't have a year. You got maybe 6 hours before they connect the dots. Before they figure out you weren't investing their money, you were stealing it. A long pause. The sound of papers rustling. Then Mickey again, his voice softer now, almost paternal. There's only one way out of this, Tommy. You gotta run. Tonight. Right now. I can't just disappear, Mickey. What about my life here? My career? What career? You think anybody's gonna hire a fund manager who lost $3 million in mob money? Mickey's voice cracked with exhaustion. Listen to me, kid. I made some calls. Got you an envelope with cash and a clean ID. Enough to get you somewhere. Safe. Start over. Where? Better you don't tell me. But Tommy, Mickey's voice grew stern, the same tone he'd used to correct footwork and fix bad habits. You stay gone. You understand? These people got long memories and longer reach. You come back, you're dead. Worse than dead. The tape continued, but Frank could barely hear it over the roar of blood in his ears. Everything he'd believed for 15 years was wrong. Tommy hadn't killed Mickey. Tommy hadn't stolen the money that night. He'd already stolen it months earlier, lost it in some Wall Street scheme gone bad. And Mickey had died trying to save the nephew who'd broken his heart. There's more, Mickey's voice said, and Frank realized the old man was talking to the recorder now, not Tommy. Whoever finds this tape, you need to know. The kid made mistakes, but he ain't evil, just weak, and weakness ain't the same as wickedness. Static filled the basement as the tape ended, but Frank couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Because if Tommy hadn't killed Mickey, if Tommy had been running for his life that night, who had pulled the trigger? And why did they want Frank to believe his nephew was a murderer? Frank's hands trembled as he rewound the tape, played it again. Mickey's voice filled the basement, each word reshaping 15 years of certainty into something unrecognizable. The concrete floor felt unsteady beneath his feet, as if the foundation of everything he'd built was shifting. He climbed the basement stairs slowly, each step a small surrender to the chaos unraveling in his mind. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen windows, painting everything in harsh angles of light and shadow. Normal morning sounds filtered in from the street. Mrs. Torino starting her car, the Sanchez kids arguing over breakfast, life moving forward like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Frank picked up his phone, scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he'd avoided calling for months. Rocky Jr. answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep. Dad, it's not even 7. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Just... Frank stared at the shattered coffee cup still scattered across the basement floor. You still coming to the job site today? Yeah. Supposed to meet with the Point Breeze contractor at 10. Why? Frank closed his eyes, saw Tommy running from Mickey's building, saw the duffel bag, saw himself making the choice to let it happen. Maybe you should skip it. Take Maria and the kids somewhere for a few days. A pause. Then Rocky Jr.'s voice, sharper now. Dad, what the hell's going on? Nothing. Everything's fine. Bullshit. You sound like you did when Mom was sick, when you thought I wasn't watching but I could see you falling apart. The comparison hit Frank like a body shot. He had been falling apart then, watching Adrian fight a battle she couldn't win while pretending everything would be okay. The same careful lies, the same protective silence. Just humor your old man, all right? Take a long weekend. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what this is about. Frank hung up, set the phone on the counter and stared at it, knowing it would ring again in 30 seconds, knowing his son wouldn't let this go. The kid had Adrian's stubbornness wrapped in Frank's sense of duty, a dangerous combination when family was threatened. The phone rang. Frank let it go to voicemail. By 8 a.m., he was dressed and walking toward the Italian market. Not because he wanted to meet Tommy, if Tommy was even the one pulling the strings, but because sitting still felt like drowning. Movement was better. Movement was fighting even when you didn't know who the opponent was. South 9th Street bustled with morning energy. Vendors setting up fruit stands, the smell of fresh bread from Villa di Roma, old men gathering outside Dynick's to solve the world's problems over coffee and arguments. Frank had walked these streets 10,000 times, but today every face seemed to watch him. Every conversation seemed to pause as he passed. At the corner of 9th and Christian, he spotted Jimmy Torino restocking his newsstand. Jimmy had been running that corner for 20 years, selling papers and gossip with equal enthusiasm. Nothing happened in the neighborhood without Jimmy knowing about it within the hour. "Hey, Frank!" Jimmy waved him over, his round face split by a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How's the construction business?" "Can't complain." Frank picked up a copy of the Inquirer, not really wanting to read it. "You been here all morning?" "Since 5. You know how it is." Jimmy's smile flickered. "Funny thing, though. Had some guys asking about you yesterday. Well-dressed fellas. Not from the neighborhood." Frank's blood chilled. "What kind of questions?" Jimmy's eyes darted around the street, checking for listeners. "Where you live, where you work, if you got family around." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Frank, I ain't one to stick my nose in other people's business, but these guys, they didn't feel right. You know what I mean?" Frank nodded, handed Jimmy a 5 for the paper. "You see them again, you call me?" "Sure thing." Jimmy pocketed the money, then grabbed Frank's wrist. "And Frank, maybe don't walk alone for a while. Not till this blows over." Frank pulled away gently. "What makes you think something's gonna blow over?" Jimmy's expression went carefully blank, just a feeling. But Frank could see it in his eyes. Fear. The kind of bone-deep terror that came from knowing dangerous people were asking dangerous questions. The same look Frank had seen on his own face in the mirror that morning. He walked away, leaving Jimmy to his newspapers and his careful silence. The neighborhood was protecting itself the only way it knew how, by pretending not to see, not to know, not to remember. The same choice Frank had made 15 years ago, the same choice that was finally coming home to collect. 1247 S 9th Street sat 2 blocks ahead, a narrow building squeezed between a butcher shop and a defunct restaurant. Frank could see it from here, could see the shadows moving in the upstairs windows. 6 hours until the meeting. 6 hours to decide if he was walking toward answers or walking toward his grave. Frank stood motionless on the sidewalk, staring at 1247 S 9th Street as if the building itself held answers. The shadows in the upstairs windows had stopped moving, but he could feel eyes watching him, cataloging his presence, recording his fear. His phone buzzed. Rocky Jr. again. Frank let it ring and immediately felt the weight of that choice. Another silence, another wall built between him and the people he loved. How many times had he done this? How many conversations had he avoided? Truths had he buried? Bridges had he burned in the name of protection? The phone buzzed again. This time, a text. "Dad, I'm coming over. Don't try to stop me." Frank's chest tightened. His son, stepping into the line of fire because Frank couldn't find the words to explain 15 years of cowardice. He turned away from 1247 S 9th Street and started walking home, but each step felt like retreat, like surrender. 3 blocks from his house, a black sedan pulled alongside him. The passenger window rolled down, revealing a face Frank didn't recognize. Sharp features, expensive suit, the kind of calculated composure that came from years of making people disappear. "Mr. Balboa, not a question. Get in. I ain't going nowhere with you." The man smiled, but his eyes stayed cold. "Your son just pulled into your driveway. Nice truck. Colorado plates. He moved out there after college, right? Thought the mountain air might help him find himself." The smile widened. "Funny thing about family. Always comes home when there's trouble." Frank's hands clenched into fists. Muscle memory from a lifetime of fighting. But this wasn't a boxing ring. This wasn't a fair fight with rules and referees. This was the world Mickey had tried to protect them all from. "What do you want?" "Same thing we've always wanted." "What's ours?" The man gestured to the back seat. "But first, we need to clear up some confusion about what really happened that night." The rear door opened. Frank looked toward his house, could see Rocky Jr.'s truck in the driveway, could imagine his son inside calling his name, finding empty rooms and cold coffee, and the shattered remnants of a quiet life finally catching fire. He got in the car. The interior smelled of leather and cigarettes. Another man sat opposite him, older, with the kind of patient stillness that spoke of decades in this business. Between them, a manila folder lay open on the seat. "You know what Mickey's problem was?" the older man said without preamble. "He thought love conquered everything. Thought if he just loved that nephew hard enough, long enough, the kid would straighten out. Frank said nothing. But Tommy was never straight. Not from day one. You know how we found out about the missing money? Mickey called us himself. October 11th, 2008. Said his nephew had made a mistake, but the family would make it right. The family. The man's voice dripped contempt. Like some washed-up trainer and his pet boxer could cover $3 million in lost outfit money. The folder contained photographs, Mickey's apartment building, Mickey's body, and then something that made Frank's world tilt sideways. Tommy, very much alive, boarding a plane at Philadelphia International. The timestamp read October 13th, 2008, the day after Mickey's murder. Your nephew didn't run that night, the older man continued. He ran the next day, after he came back to clean up loose ends. Frank's throat felt like sandpaper. You're saying Tommy... I'm saying Tommy put 2 bullets in the old man's chest when Mickey threatened to turn him in, then spent the next 15 years building a new life in Colorado, waiting for the heat to die down. The man leaned forward, waiting for the last witness to forget what he saw. The car pulled to a stop. Through the tinted windows, Frank could see they were parked outside Mickey's old gym. The building had been abandoned for years, windows boarded up, the once proud sign now just faded paint and rust. But you never forgot, did you, Frank? You just convinced yourself the story was different, that Tommy was a victim instead of a killer, made it easier to live with your choice. I didn't know... You knew enough. The older man's voice cut through Frank's protests like a blade. You saw him running, saw the bag, made a choice to let a murderer walk free because calling the cops would have been inconvenient. The younger man opened his door, gestured for Frank to follow. Time to finish what should have been finished 15 years ago. Your nephew's upstairs, waiting, says he's got something that belongs to us. Frank's legs felt heavy as lead as he climbed out of the car. The gym's front door hung open, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow light. Somewhere in that building was Tommy, not the scared kid running from mob money, but the man who'd killed the only father figure either of them had ever known. And Frank was walking straight toward him, carrying 15 years of guilt and the terrible understanding that his silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only fed the lie that was finally ready to consume them all. The stairs to Mickey's old gym groaned under Frank's weight, each step echoing in the hollow shell of what had once been sacred ground. The smell hit him first, mildew and decay, the ghost of old sweat and dreams that had died with the building's abandonment. Behind him, the 2 men followed silently, their footsteps measured and patient as undertakers. At the top of the stairs, light spilled from Mickey's old office. The door stood ajar, revealing shadows moving within. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached, 15 years of questions finally demanding answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. He pushed the door open. Tommy sat behind Mickey's desk, looking older than his 43 years, but unmistakably alive. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and lines mapped his face like scars, but his eyes held the same calculating intelligence Frank remembered. The same intelligence Frank had mistaken for fear that night. Uncle Frank. Tommy's voice carried no warmth, no guilt, no acknowledgement of the blood between them. You look good. Construction's been treating you well. Frank stepped into the room, his fists clenching reflexively. Tommy. The younger man behind Frank moved to block the door. The older one took a position by the window, casual but watchful. Tommy remained seated, completely relaxed, as if they were discussing the weather. I heard you listen to Mickey's tape, Tommy continued. Touching, wasn't it? The old man right to the end, trying to save the worthless nephew. He opened a desk drawer, pulled out a small digital recorder. But that wasn't the whole conversation, Uncle Frank. Mickey had a tendency to edit his stories. Leave out the ugly parts. Tommy pressed play. Static filled the room, then Mickey's voice. Told them it was an investment opportunity, but you never invested a dime, did you? Just moved their money around, skimmed off the top, hoped they'd never audit the books. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, came Tommy's younger voice. I was going to pay it back with interest. The market was supposed to recover. Supposed to don't mean shit when you're dealing with people who solve problems with hammers and plastic sheeting. Frank listened, his world reshaping around each word. This wasn't the conversation from the basement tape. This was later, angrier, final. I got you the cash and the ID, Mickey continued on the recording. But I'm done covering for you, Tommy. Done lying to protect a kid who ain't worth protecting. You take this money and you disappear forever, or I call them myself. A long pause. Then Tommy's voice, cold as winter. You'd really turn in your own blood? You stopped being my blood the minute you chose stealing over honor. Tommy clicked off the recorder and smiled at Frank. That's when I knew the old bastard had made his choice. Family meant nothing. Honor meant nothing. All that mattered was his precious reputation. He stood, moved around the desk to face Frank directly. So I made a choice too. You killed him. Frank's voice came out raw, barely human. I defended myself, Tommy corrected. From a man who would have seen me tortured and murdered rather than compromise his principles. His eyes glittered with something Frank had never seen before, pure, unfiltered hatred. You know what his last words were, Uncle Frank? Please, not I love you or I'm sorry, just please, the great Mickey Goldmill, begging for his life like any other mark. Frank lunged forward, but the younger man grabbed his arms, held him back. Tommy didn't even flinch. The beautiful part, Tommy continued, is that you saw me leave that night and did nothing. You had 15 years to call the police, to tell them what you witnessed, to get justice for your precious Mickey. But you chose silence. You chose to let a murderer walk free because it was easier than facing the truth. You thought what was convenient, Tommy cut him off. You thought what let you sleep at night. But deep down, Uncle Frank, you always knew. You knew I wasn't running from them. You knew I was running from him. The words hit Frank like physical blows because they carried the weight of truth he'd spent 15 years avoiding. He had known. In the deepest part of himself, beyond rationalization and self-deception, he had known. Tommy leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The funny thing is, Mickey was wrong about one thing. He thought family was about blood and loyalty and sacrifice. He smiled, and in that smile, Frank saw the complete absence of everything Mickey had tried to teach them both. But family's just another word for people who know how to hurt you best. Frank stared into his nephew's face, and finally saw what Mickey must have seen in those final moments. Not weakness, not desperation, but the cold calculation of someone who had chosen money over love, convenience over conscience, survival over soul. The man he'd protected wasn't his nephew anymore. He was just another stranger wearing a familiar face. The silence stretched like a taut wire between them. 15 years of lies finally snapping under the weight of truth. Frank felt something fundamental shift in his chest, not breaking but hardening. The protective instincts that had kept him quiet, kept him afraid, began transforming into something Mickey would have recognized, something Mickey had tried to teach him in this very room decades ago. You think you got it all figured out, Frank said quietly, shaking off the restraining hands. The men let him go, confident in their numbers, in Tommy's control of the situation. You think because you fooled me once, you can keep fooling everyone. Tommy's smile faltered slightly. I didn't fool you, Uncle Frank. I counted on your cowardice. Maybe you're right. Maybe I was a coward. Frank stepped closer, his voice growing stronger with each word. But you made one mistake, Tommy. You forgot who taught us both how to fight. Mickey's dead. Mickey's in everything he touched, every lesson, every principle you threw away. Frank gestured around the decrepit office, but his eyes never left Tommy's face. He knew what you were, even at the end. That's why he made the real tape. Tommy's composure cracked. What tape? Frank reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly so the armed men wouldn't spook. His fingers found the small cassette recorder he'd taken from his basement that morning, not to bring his evidence, but as a reminder of who he used to be. Before the silence, before the fear. The one he hid in the ventilation shaft, the one he recorded after he gave you the money. Frank's voice carried the weight of revelation, of puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. See, Mickey knew you'd come back, knew you wouldn't be able to resist tying up loose ends. So he waited. The older man by the window straightened. You're bluffing. But Frank could see the truth dawning in Tommy's eyes, the terrible understanding that Mickey had been 3 moves ahead even in death. that the old trainer had played one final game of chess with a student who thought he'd learned all the moves. "Mickey called the police before you came back," Frank continued, the words flowing from some deep well of certainty he hadn't known existed. "Told them about the money, about the threats, about a nephew who'd chosen the wrong side. But he gave them something else too. Insurance." Tommy's hand drifted toward his jacket, but the motion was uncertain now. Desperate. "He recorded your confession, Tommy. Your real confession, not the edited version where you sound like a victim." Frank took another step forward. "The one where you told him exactly how you planned to kill him and disappear, how you'd frame his murder as mob business, how you'd let me carry the guilt so I'd never talk. That's impossible. I never—" "You did." Frank's voice carried absolute conviction now, the authority of a man who'd finally stopped running from truth. "Because Mickey knew how to make you angry, knew exactly which buttons to push to make you say things you didn't mean to say. He'd been doing it to fighters for 40 years. The room tilted toward violence. Frank could feel it in the way the men positioned themselves, in the wild calculation behind Tommy's eyes. But he'd stepped past fear now, into that calm space Mickey had tried to show him so long ago, the space where thinking stopped and instinct took over. "Where is it?" Tommy's voice was barely controlled. Frank smiled, and for the first time in 15 years, it felt genuine. "Safe place, with instructions. Anything happens to me or my family, it goes straight to the police. And the FBI. And every reporter in Philadelphia." It was a complete bluff. Frank had no tape, no insurance, no protection except his willingness to finally stop backing down. But Tommy didn't know that. Tommy only knew that Mickey had always been smarter than everyone else in the room, and that 40 years of secrets might be hidden in places a desperate nephew would never think to look. The older man moved toward Frank, but Tommy held up a hand. "Wait." "Smart choice," Frank said, "because here's what's going to happen. You're going to let me walk out of here. You're going to leave my family alone. And you're going to disappear back to whatever hole you crawled out of. And if I don't?" Frank's smile widened. "Then everyone learns the truth about Mickey Goldmill's last night, about how his own nephew murdered him in cold blood, about how the great Tommy Torino built his new life on his uncle's grave." Tommy's face had gone pale, but his eyes still held that calculating gleam. Frank could see him working the angles, looking for weaknesses, for leverage. But for the first time in their relationship, Frank held all the cards, or at least Tommy believed he did, and sometimes belief was enough. The standoff held for 3 heartbeats. 4. Frank could hear his own pulse thundering in his ears, could smell the fear sweat breaking out on the younger gunman by the door. But Tommy's face was shifting, cycling through emotions like a broken slot machine. Rage, calculation, desperation, and finally something Frank recognized from their childhood, the cold fury of a cornered animal. "You know what, Uncle Frank?" Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt louder than shouting. "I think you're lying." The words hung in the air like smoke. Frank felt his bluff crumbling but held his ground, held Mickey's memory like armor around his chest. "Mickey was smart," Tommy continued, standing slowly behind the desk. "But he wasn't that smart. If he'd had real evidence, real insurance, why would he have given me the money? Why would he have let me walk out that door the first time?" Frank's mouth went dry. The logic was sound, and they all knew it. Tommy's confidence was rebuilding with each word, each step around the desk. "Because he loved you," Frank said quietly. "Right to the end, he hoped you'd make the right choice. Love." Tommy spat the word like poison. "Love gets you killed in this business. Mickey finally learned that lesson, didn't he?" The older man by the window moved closer. The younger one's hand drifted toward his jacket. Frank felt the walls of Mickey's office closing in, felt 15 years of borrowed time finally running out. But then, something unexpected happened. The sound of sirens, distant but growing closer. Tommy froze. "What did you—" "My son," Frank said, and suddenly it wasn't a bluff anymore. "Called him before I got in your car, told him if he didn't hear from me in 2 hours, call the police. Tell them about the gym." Frank checked his watch. Been 2 hours and 15 minutes. It was a lie built on hope, but hope with foundation. Rocky Jr. had been calling all morning, had texted about coming over. And Frank's son had inherited more than just his name. He'd inherited the stubborn streak that wouldn't let family disappear without a fight. Tommy's composure shattered completely now. "Kill him," he snapped at the older man. "Make it look like—" No. The refusal came from an unexpected source, the older gunman. Not with cops coming. Too messy, too many questions. "Then we leave. Now." Tommy grabbed a gym bag from behind the desk, probably containing whatever remained of the $3 million that had started this whole nightmare. Bury this problem later. But Frank had found his voice again, found the strength Mickey had always insisted was there beneath the gentleness. "There ain't gonna be no later, Tommy. This ends here." "The hell it does." Frank moved faster than any 78-year-old man had a right to move, faster than Tommy expected, certainly faster than Tommy remembered. 15 years of construction work had kept his hands strong, his reflexes sharp. But more than that, 15 years of guilt had built up pressure that finally found release. His left hook caught Tommy across the jaw with the sound of a baseball bat connecting. Tommy spun, crashed into Mickey's old filing cabinet, sent papers and memories scattering like snow. The younger gunman reached for his weapon, but Frank was already moving, muscle memory from 1,000 training sessions taking over. A straight right to the solar plexus folded the man in half. A uppercut sent him backward through the office door. The older man had his gun out now, but the sirens were close enough to rattle windows, and his eyes kept darting toward escape routes. Professional instinct warred with personal survival. Tommy struggled to his feet, blood streaming from his nose. "You think this changes anything? You think being Mickey's good little soldier makes you a hero?" His voice was thick, distorted by pain and rage. "You're still the coward who watched him die." "Yeah," Frank said, advancing on his nephew with the steady patience of a man who'd finally stopped running. "But I ain't the one who killed him." The truth of it hit the room like a physical force. 15 years of lies, 15 years of twisted narrative, 15 years of a murderer hiding behind his victim's love, all of it collapsing under the weight of simple, honest words. Tommy's face crumpled, revealing something Frank had never seen there before, genuine fear. Not of death, not of capture, but of exposure, of the world finally seeing him as he truly was. "Please," Tommy whispered, and Frank heard the echo of Mickey's last word, understood now how it must have sounded to a nephew who'd chosen money over family, survival over soul. "No," Frank said simply. The sirens screamed to a stop outside. Footsteps thundered up the stairs, car doors slammed, and in Mickey's office, surrounded by the ghosts of better men, Frank Balboa finally stopped being afraid of the truth. The police found them exactly as Frank knew they would. Tommy crumpled against Mickey's filing cabinet, the older gunman unconscious in the hallway, and Frank standing perfectly still in the center of it all like the eye of a hurricane that had finally blown itself out. Detective Maria Santos was the first through the door, weapon drawn, taking in the scene with practiced eyes that had seen too much violence in too many small rooms. But when she looked at Frank, something in his posture made her lower her gun. Frank Balboa? She knew the name, knew the legend. Every cop in Philadelphia did. "You okay?" Frank nodded toward Tommy, who was stirring weakly against the cabinet. "That's him. That's who killed Mickey Goldmill 15 years ago, his own nephew." The words came easier now, like a confession he'd been practicing his whole life without knowing it. As more officers flooded the room, as Tommy was read his rights and the evidence was bagged, Frank found himself speaking clearly and completely for the first time since that terrible night. Every detail, every moment of silence, every choice that had led him here. They took his statement at the precinct, a process that stretched through the afternoon and into evening. Frank told them everything about the missing money, about watching Tommy leave the gym, about 15 years of protecting a killer because he'd mistaken survival for loyalty. He signed papers until his hand cramped, answered questions until his voice went hoarse. But the strangest thing was how light he felt. Each word, each admission of failure, each acknowledgement of his own cowardice seemed to lift something from his shoulders that he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. Rocky Jr. was waiting when they finally released him. His son looked older somehow, worn by worry but relieved in the way that only comes after almost losing something precious. They drove home through South Philadelphia streets that looked exactly the same but felt completely different, past corner stores and row houses where neighbors still called out, "Hey, Rocky," without knowing their champion had just fought the hardest fight of his life. "You gonna be all right, Pop?" Rocky Jr. asked as they pulled into the driveway. Frank looked at his son, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years, and saw Adrian's eyes looking back at him. Gentle but strong, worried but proud, full of love that didn't need explanations or apologies. "Yeah," Frank said. "I think I am." The trial came and went like a fever dream. Tommy's lawyer tried every angle: self-defense, temporary insanity, even an attempt to paint Mickey as the real criminal. But the evidence was overwhelming, and more importantly, Frank finally found his voice. His testimony was simple, honest, devastating. A man telling the truth after 15 years of living with lies. Tommy got life without parole. The older gunman turned state's evidence and disappeared into witness protection. The younger one was already talking to prosecutors about other crimes, other victims. Frank went back to building houses. But something fundamental had changed. The work still felt good in his hands, the satisfaction of creating something solid and lasting. But now he talked to his crew, really talked, instead of hiding behind gentle silence. He called his son every evening, not just to check boxes, but to share the small details of a life finally being lived instead of endured. He visited Mickey's grave for the first time since the funeral, brought flowers, carnations, Mickey's favorite, and sat on the grass beside the headstone until the sun started to set. He told the old trainer about the trial, about finally finding his voice, about learning the difference between loyalty and fear. "Took me long enough," he said to the marble stone. "But I got there, Mick. Finally got there." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and for just a moment Frank could swear he heard something like approval in that sound, something like peace. 6 months later, Frank was framing a house in Fishtown when a young reporter approached him. She wanted to write a story about the trial, about justice delayed but not denied, about heroes who didn't know they were heroes. "I ain't no hero," Frank told her, not looking up from his work. "Just a guy who took too long to do the right thing." "But you did do it," she pressed. "Eventually." Frank set down his hammer and considered this. In the distance, he could hear the sounds of Philadelphia, traffic and construction, laughter and argument, the symphony of a city that kept moving forward no matter what. His city, Mickey's city, the place where champions were made not by winning but by getting back up. "Yeah," he said finally. "Eventually." That night, Frank slept better than he had in 15 years, and in his dreams he was young again, training in Mickey's gym, learning lessons about honor and courage and the difference between being afraid and being a coward. In his dreams, Mickey was still teaching him how to fight.